Fish 07. Theism, God or not. Theism, defined. In this book, the word theism is capitalized where it is used in reference to a supreme creator deity, normally conceived as the God of all gods, or the feminine conception of the Godhead, usually referred to as the goddess. Theism is the belief that such a divine being exists. Although there are other metaphysical schemas that incorporate the term theism in the names, such as pantheism and panentheism, they are not truly theistic, as they don't allude to a god, or to God. The word theism comes from the ancient Greek word theos, meaning God, which, in turn, means a male deity. This could refer to the supreme deity, capital G, God, or any male god, demigod, lower case g, God. I propose that the process by which such non-theistic metaphysical systems got the names is because the scholars who coined the terms were entrenched in thoroughly theistic, specifically Christian, cultural milieu, and were conditioned to think of ultimate reality as personal in nature. So, for example, if somebody in 17th century Britain was to suddenly verbalize the fact that they considered God to not be a person, but instead, some kind of impersonal energy, he or she would most probably say, I don't believe that God is a person, but some sort of infinite energy source. Even today, this kind of discourse is not uncommon, and indeed, it was something I heard more than a few times in my own journey. So, when the term pantheism was coined by mathematician Joseph Raphson in 1697, he obviously did not mean it literally, i.e., all is God, but rather, everything is the ultimate reality, since the word God specifically denotes a male deity. In this chapter of A Final Instruction Sheet for Humanity, the term theism refers exclusively to what is now known as classical theism, a form of theism in which the Godhead is characterized as the absolutely metaphysically ultimate being, in contrast to other conceptions such as pantheism, panentheism, polytheism, deism, and process theism. Classical theism is a form of monotheism. Whereas most monotheists agree that God is, at minimum, all-knowing, all-powerful, and completely holy and good, classical theism asserts that God is both immanent, encompassing or manifested in the material world, and simultaneously transcendent, independent of the material universe, simple, and having such attributes as immutability, impassibility, and timelessness. A key concept in classical theism is that created beings, i.e., material phenomena, whether sentient biological organisms or insentient matter, are dependent for their existence on the one supreme divine being. The existence of God is a subject of debate in theology, the philosophy of religion, and in popular culture. A wide variety of arguments for and against the existence of God can be categorized as logical, empirical, metaphysical, subjective, or scientific. In philosophical terms, the question of the existence of God involves the disciplines of epistemology, the nature and scope of knowledge, and ontology, study of the nature of being, or existence, and to a somewhat lesser degree, the theory of value, since some definitions of God include the notion of perfection. A supreme personal God is impossible. The English word person literally means for sound, originating from the Latin, Greek, persona, prosopa, referring to the masks worn by actors in ancient European theatrical plays, which featured a mouth hole to enable the actors to speak through. Therefore, the most essential aspect of personhood is that the individual possesses a face. The fact that we do not usually refer to a decapitated body as a person seems to confirm this claim. If you were confronted, simultaneously, with a severed head and a decapitated body, and asked to point to the person, would you point to the head or point to the body? I am certain most everyone would indicate the head, at least in the first instance, agreed. Theists, by definition, believe that there is a supreme deity, God, or the goddess, who incorporates anthropomorphic characteristics, such as a distinct, corporeal form, even if that form is a spiritual body, whatever that may connote, with a face, hence the term person, and certain personality traits such as unique preferences and aversions. Of course, they also believe that their fictitious god or goddess embodies the so-called omni-properties, but as will be clearly demonstrated herein, this is a largely nonsensical, unfalsifiable, and fallacious assertion. Of course, the more intelligent theists normally counter with, but God is not a person in the same sense as we humans are persons. God is an all-powerful spiritual being, without a body. He is all-knowing, all-loving, and present everywhere. In that case, God is most definitely not a person in the etymological sense, and not a person in even the common usage sense of the word. When did you last hear anyone refer to an omnipresent entity as being a person? The mere fact that theists use personal pronouns in reference to their non-existent deity, usually the masculine pronoun, he, proves that they have a very anthropomorphic conception of absolute reality. If God is not a male, then why use masculine pronouns? If God is, in fact, male, then why would the supreme person require gender? Does God require a female mate in order to reproduce? The most popular religious tradition, Christianity, claims that God is spirit, yet spirit is a very vague term that is rarely defined. Tangentially, the term person can be, and, in my opinion, should be used in reference to any animal that possesses a face, since most humans do not accept the fact that animals are persons, worthy of moral consideration. In recent times, animal rights activists have been heard referring to animals in such a way, as persons. The fact that vegans are still relatively rare in most nations, countries, seems to validate this assertion, that most humans do not see other animals, like birds, fish, and mammals, as persons. Otherwise, non-vegetarians, non-vegans would have no qualms about saying such things as, I'm planning to consume 3 persons for dinner tonight, in reference to 3 animals. Those who reject the assertion that animals are persons, would necessarily refuse to accept the personhood of any intelligent extraterrestrial species. That most every science fiction novel or motion picture attributes personhood to such species seems to comport with our intuition. The fact that we recognize our domestic pets having variegated personalities appears to confirm that they are, by very definition, persons. Undoubtedly, if highly intelligent humanoid extraterrestrial life exists, we would all refer to those alien species as persons. Similarly, if we were to somehow come across a Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalensis, surely we would consider him or her to be a person, even if the Neanderthal was unable to communicate in any semblance of a modern language. Therefore, it is an undeniable, objective fact, that the term, person, does not refer exclusively to Homo sapiens, and that when the word is used in reference to the supreme deity, it strongly implies that the deity possesses more than just a mind of some kind, but also a face of some sort. Some major theistic religions say as much, anyhow. The main reason for theists claiming that their omnipresent God is a person, is simply because they equate mind with personhood. The absurdity of an omni-being. There has never been, nor will there ever be, even the slightest shred of evidence for the existence of the Godhead, that is, a supreme deity, for the notion of an omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent person, is both profoundly illogical and extremely incongruous, to put it mildly. At the risk of sounding facetious, any human being who believes in a gigantic man, or woman, perched in the heavens, is a literal moron. Regarding the omnipresence of God, if a supreme person was present everywhere, it would imply that one would be able to visually perceive such a person at every location. Of course, theists claim that their fictitious God is imperceptible via the bodily senses, but that she can be experienced solely in one's heart, by which they mean mentally, or spiritually. Clearly, there is no way in the world one could possibly consider such a being, by definition, to be personal in nature. And if it was so, this being would be a separate object. See the glossary definition of object. How could a personal God be present everywhere, when there was no such thing as a created universe before he created it? This implies that, before God created the world, he was not located in any particular place, yet became omnipresent only after creation was manifested. Note that when the term personal God is used in this book, it does not imply that there exists, either potentially or actually, an impersonal God, for that is a flagrant oxymoron, given the most accurate understanding of the term person. The term personal God is used purely in order to emphasize the fact that God is indeed a person, for how can a male deity be anything other than a person, at least hypothetically, because obviously, the reality of a supreme creator God is both an ontological and an epistemological impossibility. Theists may contend that God is infinite, both before and subsequent to any creative act, but again, this would necessitate God being situated in every possible point in space, which makes sense only if God was not a person, and hence, not a god, goddess, definitionally, see glossary. When we look around us, we do not see any semblance of a personal deity anywhere in creation, so to claim that God is omnipresent is an obvious falsehood. Theists would argue that God is present in his creation, in some kind of mysterious way, such as in the form of his Holy Spirit or via some other vague model, but that contradicts the very definition of the word God, see the glossary entries for God and God. If this fictitious deity was actually present everywhere, as claimed by most all theists, there would exist nothing but God, which is closer to a pantheistic metaphysical schema, rather than a monotheistic system. The mental gymnastics that theist apologists invoke, in order to justify the existence of the Godhead, is truly puerile and mesmerizing. Also, this would bring into play the question of time. Without time, how does God deliberate on his desire to create a material universe? Even if God decided to manifest the material world instantly, that instantaneous moment of time would fall within a space of meta-time, and even if that was not the case, this instant magnitude of time would itself be temporal, since according to physics, ontology, as well as philosophy, epistemology, it is certain that there must be a minimal measurement. Likewise, why would the absolute require omnipotence, when there is naught but the absolute extant? Of course, theists would argue that once God has created the material universe, he requires total power and control over his creation, otherwise, he wouldn't be, by definition, the supreme. However, this argument itself easily falls apart, when one understands the simple fact that the universe, at least our particular bubble universe, is composed of space-time, that time is relative, and therefore, cannot supervene upon the eternal, timeless absolute. If God is all-powerful, surely it implies that no other being possesses any power, since all extant power is confined to the supreme God alone, yes. The only omni-property that comes even close to being an accurate description of ultimate reality is omniscience, since the monad knows absolutely everything there is to know, and that is, the monad itself. See the previous 2 chapters for further clarification of this concept. On the other hand, there is a possible infinite epistemological regression problem regarding the omniscience of God, des. Since God knows absolutely everything, he obviously knows that he knows everything. Consequently, God knows that he knows everything, correct? So, how far does this knowledge of knowledge retrogress? Of course, one could say, infinitely, but certainly this is too perplexing. Objects, whether conceptual objects or material objects, are by nature, if not by definition, finite and temporary, and can never be infinite. Many theologians have added the property of omnibenevolence, infinite goodness, to the 3 major omniproperties. Above all, it is imperative to understand that goodness can only make sense in relation to badness, and therefore is nonsensical in reference to the absolute. First of all, one would be required to provide an incontestable definition of the term good, and then demonstrate that God is absolutely always good, without the slightest hint of badness. Assuming that even one of the major theistic religions is correct, this assertion would be difficult to substantiate, to put it mildly. Even so, if God is transcendental to all dualities, he cannot be good, since goodness cannot exist without a measure of badness, and consequently, God must be infinitely bad as well as infinitely good, or at least beyond both good and bad. See the glossary entries, absolute, bad, good, and evil, the problem of. Also, read chapter 03, regarding the notion of concepts, truth. Omni-properties are unverifiable. How would it be possible to even perceive the infinite nature of God, in order to authenticate his existence. If, for example, someone was to witness an appearance or an apparition of God, it would obviously be an appearance within the constraints of time and space, not to mention an experience that is taking place solely within one's consciousness. See Chapter 04. How then could one feasibly verify that this person was omnipresent, and similarly, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and/or omniscient? Obviously, one would require omniscience, in order to properly substantiate that another being possessed unlimited knowledge. Furthermore, if God is infinitely benevolent, he certainly has a strange way of demonstrating his supreme goodness, considering the amount of gratuitous pain and abject misery one can clearly see in the world around us. Coincidentally, the day before this paragraph was composed, I met a guy at the clinic of our chiropractor, who honestly believed that Lord Sri Krishna, almost definitely a fictional character in ancient Indian mythology, appeared to him on the rooftop of his residence in the United States of America, and bestowed upon him a new name. Unsurprisingly, my brief attempt to convince this American gentleman of the illusory nature of his apparition proved futile, and concluded with his assertion that I was unable to prove that God did not exist, even though I informed him that I had fully demonstrated precisely that, in the 7th chapter of the most important work of literature ever conceived, the book that you are presently reading, or listening to, if you are using a text-to-voice application or an audiobook. Mystical experiences, such as that described above, are certainly possible, for I myself have experienced a number of such things, but they cannot provide anything more than anecdotal evidence for any metaphysical claim, especially the claim made by theists for the existence of a perfect person, who creates mind and matter. And even if there was such a divine being, the veracity of his, her existence would have little to no bearing on the most exigent thing in our lives, and that is, finding the true, unadulterated peace and happiness to which we all aspire. See Chapter 15, regarding peace and happiness. Many, if not most, religionists seem to believe that simply worshipping God automatically bestows immediate peace and joy upon the human being, but if you would like to carefully read the aforementioned chapter, it will be obvious that this is not the case. Assuming that he exists, God cannot magically cause any person to be free of mental anguish, and even if that was to occur, God would be violating the freedom of volition that theists are so fond of evoking whenever the problem of evil is raised by we atheists. See that entry in the glossary of this book. The paradox of a timeless sphere. Many otherwise perspicacious theists, particularly the members of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, a radical Hindu cult, first established in the United States of America in the late 1960s, by a truly delusional retired pharmacist, named Mr. Abhay C. De, honestly believe that the ground of all being is a youthful Indian gentleman with dark blue-tinged black skin color, who currently resides on his own planet in the spiritual world, and spends his days cavorting around with a bunch of cowherd girls. If one were to ask those ISKCON devotees how Lord Krishna manages to incorporate relative time into the timeless realm, since it takes a certain amount of time for him to play his flute and to frolic with his girlfriends, then I'm not sure how they would answer, but they would undoubtedly dismiss the argument, using illogical semantics. I'm ashamed to admit that I too was previously one of those deluded religionists who believed such foolish nonsense. Thankfully, I managed to break free from that brainwashing cult, and following decades of sincere seeking, came to be the current world teacher himself. Above, I made the claim that many members of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, would undoubtedly dismiss the argument I made regarding the apparent inclusion of time in the spiritual world, using illogical semantics. I recently watched a video on the internet in which a couple of leading figures from that cult did precisely that. The most unfortunate thing about such foolish teachers is the fact that they invariably either disregard or berate those persons who attempt to explicate the most accurate concepts available. How sad. Related to the thesis that God is transcendental to time, is the immutability of God. Immutability means God does not change in any way. Yet, as already mentioned above, all theistic traditions necessarily speak of God as changing his mind a multitude of times, so it would be extremely difficult for theists to defend the proposition that God never changes. Perhaps they disbelieve the assertion that God made man in his image, since we humans are constantly changing, imperfect beings. Again, how can God decide to create this world, without a time scale? Impassibility, a corollary to immutability, means that God does not experience emotional change in any way. God cannot be acted upon or moved by any other source. He does not suffer, his character, his will, and his promises never change. Obviously, this too contradicts what every theistic tradition has overtly taught, in relation to their fictitious deity, as evidenced by the narratives in their holy scriptures. As to be expected, modern theologians have devised a plethora of crafty justifications for God's impassibility, but the mere fact that he is incapable of change says much of this supposedly perfect person. Also, it implies we have abilities that God does not, and thus we are somehow superior. God is unintuitive. Here is a thought experiment that shows how unintuitive is the concept of God, goddess, that is, the supreme male deity, or the goddess. It could easily be applied also to the notion of reincarnation, as well as to a host of other nonsensical, unverifiable, and unfalsifiable dogmas. Imagine that you were born into a society in which there was absolutely no mention of a supreme deity, nor any indications of such a divine person in architecture, literature, the World Wide Web, or in any other field or facet of life. What do you believe would be the chances of you spontaneously formulating the idea of the Godhead, completely independently? Likewise for the notions of reincarnation, heaven, etc. On the other hand, for thousands of years, history has witnessed literally millions of occasions in which humans, often those who have been exposed to minimal religious milieu, have awakened to their authentic, essential nature as the divine. This, in itself, is middling evidence that ultimate reality is not a separate, discrete object, God, but the very ground of all being, Brahman, or the Tao. See also ch. 16, paragraph 4. Common sense dictates that ultimate reality must necessarily transcend all dualistic concepts, including the personality-impersonality dichotomy. Yet, only an excruciatingly minute number of humans have ever grasped this complete understanding and realization. Neither eternal beingness, unlimited consciousness, nor blissful quietude, Sakhidananda, in Sanskrit, necessitate personality. See chapters 05 and 06, to properly understand the nature of ultimate reality, and chapter 03, to learn how to distinguish mere concepts from absolute truth. Intelligent design. The wisest theologians will, when hard pressed, admit that the primary reason for theists referring to ultimate reality as personal in nature, is because the absolute has some kind of mind, by which they mean, in actual fact, a universal, infinite consciousness. However, it is indeed possible, and factually, is the case, that the foundation of being is pure conscious being itself. Universal conscious awareness, Purusa, or Brahman, in Sanskrit, can and does include all characteristics belonging to pure being, such as unconditional love, unadulterated prehension, etc., and we humans are, in essence, identical in nature. In other words, we are, metaphorically, God, Ayam Brahmasmi, in Sanskrit. Most postulations for the existence of a supreme creator God are actually arguments for the intelligent design of the perceivable universe, and not for the intelligent designer being a person as such. According to idealism, the phenomenal sphere is naught but an appearance in consciousness. Therefore, to assert that there is a cause of all causes is a reasonable conclusion, but to abruptly attribute that first cause to be a male or female, or even an androgynous deity, is a non sequitur. There is no evidence for any phenomena, without conscious awareness. The rationale for theism. There are at least 4 possible reasons why many humans are convinced of the existence of a personal God, i.e., the supreme, male, deity. 1. Because it is natural for any sensible person to believe that humans may not be the pinnacle of existence, and that there must be a higher power or ultimate creative force, an intelligent designer. However, because they cannot conceive of this designer being non-personal, they automatically suspect it must be a man, God, or a woman, the goddess, with personal attributes. One who is truly awakened and/or enlightened understands that the universal self is the creator of all experiences, and that he is the THEISM in Sanskrit. Also, some theists use teleological arguments, claiming that humans have an instinctive disposition towards worshipping God. This may be so, but it is not evidence of ultimate reality being personal in nature. Again, that thou art, the worshipper and the worshipped are of the same essence. 2. Because they may have experienced some kind of mystical phenomenon or miracle that they mistakenly attribute to God's grace, but which can be more plausibly explicated by another means. As explained, all such phenomena are produced by the true self of all selves, Paramatman, in Sanskrit. I, the author of this holy scripture, have personally experienced very powerful, miraculous, mystical phenomena, which I formerly ascribed to the personal conception of God, since I was a theist, but now know to be caused, ultimately, by the real self. The real self is synonymous with the Tao, the Great Spirit, Brahman, pure consciousness, eternal awareness, necessary existence, the ground of all being, uncaused nature, the undifferentiated substratum of reality, the unified field, the source of all, etc. I would assert that a large proportion of theists are those who have experienced some kind of mystical phenomenon, whether that be a peak awakening experience, including Kundalini experiences, speaking in tongues, etc., an inner or outer locution, an audible voice or an internal voice, or, seemingly, physical apparition, and attribute the phenomenon to God, due to their conditioning and lack of critical analysis. 3. Because they may have witnessed the deeds or read the words of an individual who seems to be a perfect person, in other words, an incarnation of the divine principle, avatara, in Sanskrit. To be sure, such characters may exist, but this does not automatically prove that the supreme truth is inherently personal. An avatara is a man who is fully enlightened, with all noble qualities, but not necessarily perfect in every possible way. For example, very few, if any, of the recognized avatars in human history taught or practiced veganism. We atheists are patiently awaiting the time when the perfectly loving God will publicly show himself to his beloved creatures, rather than merely sending imperfect representatives to this planet, under the guise that they are fully divine. This is known as the problem of divine hiddenness. Of course, this will never ever occur, because, as I think that I have sufficiently demonstrated, a supreme personal God is a logical impossibility. The fact that a person who claims that God has spoken directly to him would be publicly humiliated is evidence of this. If I told you that God is speaking directly to me at every moment of my waking life, you would laugh at my claim, because you know that God never speaks to humans. 4. Because they may have been conditioned by their family, society and/or religious organization over many years, or even several decades. Unfortunately, we humans are very gullible. Due to low intelligence and a lack of critical analytical skills, the typical person believes almost anything they read or hear from virtually any source, no matter how unreliable. During a visit to one's local place of worship on any given weekend, one will notice a congregation of sheepish individuals, gleefully nodding in agreement with practically every nonsensical, inane word pontificated by the deluded priest, mullah, rabbi, guru, monk, or preacher. Even the current world teacher, despite his genius intellect, was once a thoroughly indoctrinated, fundamentalist theist, before he awoke to a definitive understanding of life, and composed this holy writ. Mysticism and Prophecy. Above, it was asserted that the cause of all mystical experiences, either peak experiences of a unitary, hypostatic nature, or else some kind of spiritual awakening experience in which there remains a dualistic relationship, that is, the individual person being in relation to a higher being such as an angel, a god, or God himself, are predicated on the very same source, and that this source is Brahman, the impersonal ground of all being, which is being itself. Logically, since there can be only one source of all, both categories of mystical experience must necessarily originate from the very same source. So, then, why would this purely impersonal source instigate both impersonal, absolute, and personal, relative, experiences? In other words, for what reason do some humans experience events such as apparitions of God, angels, or saints, when ultimately, such figures are illusory? This is simply because, as explained in Chapter 16, Devotional Religion, Bhakti Yoga, for those familiar with Sanatana Dharma, is not only an authentic system of yoga, but it is far and away the most popular. Even though some of the paragraphs of this sacred scripture may seem to denounce theism, devotion to a conception of God can be beneficial to both individuals and to societies. So, in other words, even though God is a fictitious character, societies that are united in a common theistic creed, ideally, demonstrate greater societal cohesion, just as nations that are founded on non-theistic or polytheistic belief structures, such as Shintoism, show a similar cohesion. The main issue I have with theists is the fact that they invariably are afflicted with a very narrow-minded mentality, focused solely on their own in-group. So, if you have witnessed a dream in which you speak to God, you were not experiencing a personal deity, but merely that isolated experience in itself. To make it even more terse, you had a dream in which you, as a dream character, conversed with another dream character, who identified himself as God, or some other religious personality, such as an angel. To extrapolate that there is an actual personal deity, somewhere within or without the spatio-temporal universe, is nothing more than a post hoc assumption, based upon weak evidence. Similarly, when a person experiences memories of a claimed past incarnation, either in the waking state, in dreams, or under hypnotism, those experiences do not necessarily prove that the individual in question actually experienced those events in another life. However, they definitely do prove that the person experienced those cognitive images in the present, for all memories are nothing but present-time experiences. Psychological research over the past century has demonstrated that false memories can be generated in the mind. The fact that no two persons who experience a singular event, such as a traffic accident or a robbery, recall the same details and in the same chronological order, seems to confirm those findings. Of course, this explanation, although eminently logical and cogent, will fail to convince the vast majority of religious fanatics who may have experienced mystical occurrences, including myself, when I was a deluded theist for well over 2 decades. Likewise, if an occurrence of miraculous healing takes place, that event was predestined to have occurred from all eternity, as part of the story of this universe. If one alleges that the supreme deity, God, Des, caused the healing, it is nothing more than an unverifiable assertion or claim. So, to summarize, the sights, smells, sounds, tastes, textures, thoughts, feelings and images experienced during the waking state are precisely that, appearances within consciousness. The sights, smells, sounds, tastes, textures, thoughts, and feelings experienced during the dreaming state are precisely that, appearances within consciousness. The sights and sounds of angelic, God-like figures, as well as alleged out-of-body and near-death experiences that occur during the waking state or under general anesthesia, are precisely that, intrinsic appearances within consciousness. Unfortunately, this highly scientific explanation, or description, to be more precise, rarely convinces those who have witnessed mystical phenomena, that their experiences are simply endogenous to their own, discrete, conscious awareness, called chitta, in Sanskrit. In the case of this author, I have experienced several mystical experiences, including an extremely powerful gift of speaking in tongues, whilst praying over a woman in a Roman Catholic charismatic prayer meeting, in the month of March, 1994. The experience was of an external force literally taking over my faculty of speech, and speaking in a very loud and forceful manner, in a language unknown to me, for at least a couple of minutes. There is not the slightest doubt in my mind that it was not me that was speaking. I was merely witnessing the event as if I was a third person. Because I was a devout Christian monk at the time, I automatically attributed the source of the experience to God. Of course, several decades later, after much maturation, I have now realized that the ontology of a supreme person is a metaphysical impossibility, and that my experience of speaking in tongues, as well as my other mystical experiences, were simply episodes in the narrative of this universal creation, or story of life, and that this creation is merely an urge of the Creator, and that the created is essentially identical with the Creator. Just as with the aforementioned mystical experiences, prophecies, in which a person foretells a future event that he or she could not possibly have foreseen by any ordinary means, are usually attributed to the personal conception of ultimate reality, i.e., the Godhead. However, such prophetic declarations are nothing more than an event in the story of this universe, preordained from all eternity. As explained in Chapter 05, the so-called block theory of time is an accurate understanding of temporality, so it is not inconceivable that certain persons have this ability. Even though there cannot exist a supreme personal creator God, neither epistemologically nor ontologically, the predestined sequence of events of this universe embraces diverse theistic belief systems, at least within the past 20,000 years or so, including phenomenal manifestations that superficially seem to support theism, yet upon conscientious investigation, proves to be unrelated to the existence of God. Divine simplicity. In order to further elucidate on the doctrine of divine simplicity, which states that God is without parts, the general idea can be stated in this way: the being of God is identical to the properties of God. To put it in other terms, ultimate reality is not a complex or a composite. Thus, ultimate reality is not a deity, the male Godhead, who possesses a mind made of imaginary thoughts, an intellect composed of conceptual thoughts, an illusory sense of self, a physical body, clothed in some kind of garb, and separate from his creation, or her creation, for those who believe in the goddess. Ultimate reality is simply beingness itself. A typical theist may then maintain, but beingness itself doesn't imply that the absolute has a will of its own, with the desire to create universes, etc. This is possibly the reason why the seers of ancient Bharata, India, added the property of consciousness to being, and furthermore unending bliss. However, strictly speaking, ultimate reality is supremely simple. Beingness, isness, implies absolute cognition, blissfulness, eternality, and the appearance of infinite attributes. Thus, there are no thoughts within Nirguna, Brahman, since thinking various thoughts, or contemplating divers images, can take place only within the realm of time. Nirguna Brahman is pure, unadulterated consciousness itself, which appears as Saguna Brahman, in which thoughts may appear, assuming that there is extant a creation within Brahman, mind you, in which time is one of the aspects of the created universe, and of course, if there are individuated creatures who have the capability to think thoughts and see images, such as animals like we human beings. Personally, I find it difficult to envisage any phenomenal, objective universe that is bereft of time, for such a created universe would be completely static, even though its creation would entail some degree of motion, therefore a fully inert cosmos is difficult to imagine. NB. You may have noticed that ultimate reality is not referred to as the ultimate reality, because the word the implies that reality is an object of some kind, whereas ultimate reality is the subject of all subjects and objects, or a collapse of the subject-object disjunction. Yet another way to describe the same concept is as follows: the superposition of the subject, Nirguna Brahman, and the object, Saguna Brahman, is the sole reality. Materialism is the philosophy of the subject who forgets to take account of himself. Arthur Schopenhauer. Evidence required. If God is factually the supreme personal being that most theists assert, and he must be definitionally, since the word means a male deity, surely there must be evidence of his existence, in the same way that any other personal being can be proven to exist. For example, if one was to claim that the king of rock and roll, Mr. Elvis Aaron Presley, actually existed, one would need to provide sufficient evidence for that claim, such as photographic, film, and audio recordings, an authenticated birth certificate, land title deeds, any extant historical records, etc. Likewise, if one claims that God exists, one is obliged to offer ample, tangible validation, such as, at least nowadays, videographic and/or photographic evidence. Undoubtedly, some rather duplicitous characters will retort thus: but how can you be certain that the man pictured in those films is really Elvis? He may be an imposter. Obviously, the name of the man is of secondary importance to the fact of his existence. Whatever was his real name, there seems to be strong evidence that such a character really existed. After all, A Christian could easily assert that Allah does not exist, even though the word, Allah, is simply a name that is used by Muslims to indicate the supreme deity. Furthermore, theists will make the claim that it is impossible to provide tangible evidence for God, since he is spirit, but this point has been fully settled. Having stated the above, the worship of the personal deity, Bhakti Yoga, in Sanskrit, albeit an imaginary figure, is a legitimate spiritual path for the masses. See Chapter 16, regarding the 4 systems of religion, including devotional yoga. However, the most accurate understanding is monistic or non-dual, Advaita, in Sanskrit, but unfortunately, only an insignificant proportion of humanity possesses the intelligence and the analytical reasoning skills to discover this reality. All this was predestined from eternity, so there is no need to criticize or belittle those who are encumbered by obviously fallacious beliefs. To be quite honest, I was personally benefited from practicing devotional yoga for a quarter of a century, though I wish I had discovered monism a decade or more earlier. For expositions of other major metaphysical systems, see the glossary entries, Advaita, Idealism, Materialism, Monism, Pantheism, and Panentheism. See to the 10th paragraph of Chapter 04, regarding the beneficial effects of a nation following the same religious tradition, even one of the extant theistic mythologies, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The serious issues arise only when such theistic ideologies clash, as witnessed by the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian war. Factually, there is far more evidence for the existence of Santa Claus than evidence for the actuality of an eternal creator god, or goddess. That theist apologists often go to extreme lengths, in order to demonstrate the existence of their supposedly all-pervading deity, is hilarious. In conclusion, regarding the aforementioned metaphysical groundings, one hypothesis that I have contrived is as follows. Note, this is a gross generalization. Those seekers who are either young of age or of a simple disposition, commonly believe that there is a supreme person, usually the male deity, overseeing the material universe. Those theists who are more intelligent and/or thoughtful, will question the viability and plausibility of a giant man in the sky, and move towards a more pantheistic understanding of reality, especially after they consider how the God can possibly be omnipresent, as is claimed by most all theistic traditions, and perhaps transition to a panpsychic, panentheistic schema, which is a rather more monistic extension of pantheism. Thereafter, one may come to learn of idealism and enthusiastically embrace that point of view, as it seems to be a quite logical system of metaphysics. Finally, one may transcend idealism by coming to realize that dual aspect monism is by far the most rational understanding of universal principles. This was the approximate process I myself underwent on my spiritual journey. Right-pointing arrow. It is high time for humanity to awaken from all inane superstitions, such as the belief in a personal God, Des, who created the universe. No man has seen God at any time. It is difficult to believe that nobody has ever visually identified a fictional deity, wouldn't you agree? The Gospel of John, 1:18, New King James Version. God is greater than God. Theologians may quarrel, but the mystics of the world speak the same language. Where there is isness, there God is. Creation is the giving of isness from God. That is why God becomes where any creature expresses God. There is something in the soul that is so akin to God that it is one with Him. It has nothing in common with anything created. The knower and the known are one. Simple people imagine that they should see God as if He stood there and they hear. This is not so. God and I, we are one in knowledge. The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. Eckhart von Hochheim, O.P. aka Meister Eckhart. German Roman Catholic priest. God is merely one of man's concepts, a symbol used for pointing the way to the ultimate reality, which has been mistaken for the reality itself. The map has been mistaken for the actual territory. Worshippers may derive some sort of satisfaction or peace of mind through worship of a concept such as God, created by themselves, but it is a futile process, from the viewpoint of experiencing one's true nature. What is seeking? Seeking is, you, wanting to know God. Whatever you know is an object, and you are the subject. So if you want to know God, how to do so? You are the subject and God is the object, but what exists is the other way around. God is the subject and you are the object. The final understanding: there is, and never was, a seeker. At that understanding's cusp, you see yourself, at last, not as the person, but as God Himself. The person is an object, but you are the subject in which all objects arise. You are the experiencing of everything that arises. When you recognize this, you no longer care whether this or any person has reached the final understanding, because you've ceased identifying as a person. You realize you are not the person. You are God experiencing yourself through the person. Now, you see, this always has been the case. Even when experiencing the illusion of separateness, you were God. You recognize that you, as God, do this, through and as every person who has lived or ever will live. Each person's apparently stable, separate identity, each human's sense of independent authorship of their actions, is part of the plan. It is how God plays, how God rolls, how God rolls. God dresses up, as each person with their quirks, puts them in boring or interesting settings, and then experiences what happens. Far from being a screw-up in need of fixing, it is how the universe experiences itself. A person understanding God would be akin to a rock understanding a geologist. A person is an unaware object, one attribute of which is an illusory sense that it is a subject. God experiences this person, and through the person, God experiences the world. Only God can experience. Ramesh S. Balsekar, Indian spiritual teacher. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There cannot be a God, because if there were one, I could not believe that I was not he. Which is it? Is man one of God's blunders, or is God one of man's? Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, German philosopher. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Epicurus, Greek philosopher. We must question the story logic of having an all-knowing, all-powerful God, who creates faulty humans, and then blames them for his own mistakes. Gene Wesley Roddenberry, American television screenwriter and producer. You can't convince a believer of anything. For their belief is not based on evidence, it's based on a deep-seated need to believe. Carl Edward Sagan, American astronomer, cosmologist, astrophysicist, astrobiologist and author. I do not think it is necessary to believe that the same God who has given us our senses, reason, and intelligence wished us to abandon their use, giving us by some other means the information that we could gain through them. Galileo di Vincenzo Bonaiuti de Galilei. Italian astronomer, physicist and engineer.